Murder at the Liberty Ballroom. Episode 2.
Frank had not yet met Sheriff Crane, but that was just about to change. A 7:30 meeting had been arranged by his staff before he left Tucson. He was tired from the trip, he said, and stuffed with too much spaghetti and wine. All he wanted to do was just go to his motel room and get some sleep, after trying to figure out what he had or hadn't sensed back at the Liberty Ballroom. When Frank arrived at the sheriff's station on Main Street, there were lots of media vans pulling away. A dozen or so people that he assumed to be reporters were climbing into their cars. He figured that Crane had probably just finished up a press conference. Frank always told us that there was something about police stations, those kinds of places, that made him almost physically ill. Because he said he didn't sense law and order. He sensed fear. And this old building that was in front of him, he said it had a stench of its own that was especially heavy in the basement where Sheriff Crane's private office was located. Crane looked up from what was probably his press notes, but he didn't have much reaction when he saw Frank. It's like he was debating whether or not he was a reporter with one last question, Anyway, Frank just jumped in and introduced himself. What he wasn't prepared for was Sheriff Crane's reaction.
So you're the infamous Frank Batelle. I told the governor I didn't want any psychic muddying up police work, but she wouldn't listen. Sit down, Batelle, but don't plan on staying long. I'm tired and I want to go home. Just tell me what you came up with at the ballroom this afternoon.
And of course Frank told him it just wasn't that easy. One visit, But Crane interrupted him by asking how long he planned to be in town. Frank told him the truth. He said, I really can't say.
Well, I can say. You're going to be here till you come up with something I can use to make an arrest. I'd like to think my investigators will beat you to it, but we don't have a lot of experience with murder. But you, now that's a different story. Intrigue, gauzy figures, that's your bag, I hear.
Frank could understand what the attitude was all about. He was there to do a job. Anyway, he tried to salvage the situation by getting down to the facts. That's all he wanted. Just the facts. So he asked him if that was his hometown. And Crane said, yeah, he was born and raised 10 miles, actually, from that very spot. But then he very quickly added, what's that got to do with anything? Frank told him what he was thinking, that they're probably around the same age, so he probably went to school with Audrey Hilliard, probably knew who her friends were, probably knew who wasn't her friend. And Crane said, how's that tie into the woman getting herself murdered yesterday? And Frank said the logical thing. He said, well, it might be a good idea to know who's holding a grudge.
Last time she was here was 45 years ago. That'd be some kind of grudge.
And that's when Frank said he got his first genuine nudge from the gift. He saw a flash of the guy in front of him, the way he looked at 18, and he had a crown on his head. So he took a wild guess at what that meant, and Frank said, 1977, homecoming king, and the color drained from the sheriff's face. But the reaction ended almost as fast as it came. Oh, that man, he was disciplined, and he was on his toes. Anyway, finally he said, yeah, same year Audrey was homecoming queen. I don't get the significance. Frank would hate to have to admit it, but he didn't get it either. So he said, "What's your take on the situation, Sheriff?" The sheriff said his take was that they had a madman in their midst, a nut who shot and killed a movie star. Frank had to ask if he really believed that people still thought of her that way. I mean, she hadn't made a film in over 20 years. And then the sheriff reminded him, well, she was a political figure too, don't forget. And Frank said, but Ghana doesn't seem to be that much of a threat to our country. It doesn't seem like assassinating the ex-ambassador would really create much of a stir.
It's news enough. The media's driving us insane.
Frank suggested they go back to the grudge theory. That made the sheriff thoroughly disgusted. So Frank scrambled to get back topside on this so-called interview, and he asked him what he remembered about a fight between Audrey and a girl at the Liberty Ballroom when they were about 18 years old. Crane said again, 40-some years ago. Are you really nuts? Franks reminded him, well, they drew quite a crowd, and the girl did vow to get even with Audrey, even if it took the rest of her life.
Didn't happen. If you're such a hotshot psychic, you'd know everybody loved Audrey. Everybody.
Frank said, you don't have to be a psychic to know that one person certainly didn't. Frank had told us that usually at the beginning of a case, he had a hard time sleeping because images, they just teased him, they taunted him, he said, and impressions that made no sense just seemed to come and go in his head. But for some reason, that didn't happen on the first night in the little town on the prairie. He told us that the minute he hit the bed, the word skeleton danced in front of him. It wasn't enough to keep him awake very long, but he was curious. Audrey Hilliard's death was fresh. Skeleton, well, that indicates something old, very old. What was the connection? There was no image, he said. There was just the word. White block letters on a black background. Just flashing off and on and off and on. Said the last thing the gift said as he tumbled into oblivion was, "It's the key." Oh, great. An old murder was the key to the whole affair. He said he just mumbled to himself, "I'll puzzle it all out tomorrow," as the world went blissfully dark. It was nearly 8 when he got up the next morning, and by 8:30 he said he'd had a bagel and a cup of black coffee in the motel's continental breakfast room. He said it was like trying to recall a dream. He vaguely remembered something about the word skeleton being the key to the case, but he was inclined not to believe it. So he pushed the thought away as he scrolled his iPhone for the address of the local library. Since there was only one school in town, his intention was to go through the 1977 yearbook in an effort to find a picture that matched the face of the girl who had argued with Audrey in the ballroom. The girl with the lifelong grudge. Or was it an argument that was forgotten the next day? You know, the way it usually is at that age. His instincts said no. His instincts told him to keep going, that he was headed in the right direction. But then again, like he kept saying, the gift sometimes misled him. One never knew. Frank found the library with no problem, really, and introduced himself to the librarian as the private investigator working with Sheriff Crane on the Audrey Hilliard murder. And that's when the librarian said, Audrey Hilliard. So Frank said, "What can you tell me about her?" He went on to say, "I realize you're too young to have known her when she lived here, but surely there were stories." Well, it seems like the librarian was mighty willing to tell stories. She told him that her mom went to school with Audrey, and she was a year behind her, so they weren't best friends or anything like that. But when vandals nearly destroyed the library and the school, and the town didn't have the funds to rebuild, she didn't hesitate to call on Audrey, who was quite a star by then, or had been. She hadn't made a picture in a while, but she was still famous. The librarian's mom was a teacher by then, and she figured, well, why not ask her? Doesn't hurt to ask. After all, Audrey had gone to this school from the first grade through graduation. Surely that would count for something. So Frank said, and? Did it? And the librarian said, oh, sure. Audrey said she'd be happy to make a donation. In fact, the figure she quoted, it was so generous that Mom went to the mayor and the city council and the school board to recommend that they name the new structure the Audrey Hilliard Library. Everybody was ecstatic. Lots of press, lots of backslapping. Gave Mom a special luncheon as a thank you, the librarian said. Only the woman never sent the money. Never contacted her. Never explained what happened. Nothing. It was like she disappeared. Next thing they heard, she was ambassador to someplace in Africa. She wasn't even living in the States anymore. That's when a new thought struck Frank. Like, if the mother still lived in the area, maybe it was her grudge he needed to give consideration. But before he could ask about her, the librarian swallowed back tears and said that her mom was living in a nursing home. She was suffering from dementia. Not a candidate for a killer, but how deep was the librarian's resentment, Frank wondered. Anyway, he thumbed through the yearbook until he found what he was looking for and found that the name under the photo was Janet Dennison. He asked the librarian if he knew her. She was Willard Crane's high school girlfriend, the librarian said, or was before Audrey took him away from her. Frank said, girlfriend? You sure about that? I mean, like you say, that was way before your time. And the woman reminded Frank just how small the town really was. And she said that Janet had never moved away. In fact, she not only still lived in the area, she had a library card. So less than 5 minutes later, Frank was on his way to 448 Miners Cove, Country Road 120. It was a ways out of town, but Frank had a lot to think about while following directions on the GPS. The sheriff had dated the woman he was about to meet, Janet Dennison. Dated her until Audrey stole him away from her. So, that's what the ballroom fight was all about. What he couldn't figure was why Crane hadn't mentioned his relationship with Audrey. He was positive the governor had no clue, or she would have told him. No, this was something Crane had no intention of sharing, but he wasn't sure why. When he said that to himself, he said the gift kicked him in the pants. Crane didn't tell him because Crane knew he would become a suspect. At the very least, a person of interest. That would be a problem. You know, when a person keeps a secret from a psychic, that means they feel their secret safe. And that means they have zilch faith in the psychic in the first place. You know, Frank explained to us one day, he said, those who don't understand what people like him do, they might wonder why he didn't just go to Crane and ask him outright about his relationship with Audrey. But he told us that's not how it works. His job wasn't to ask questions. His job was to sense answers that go deeper, that reveal more. He had a reputation for unveiling the truth when routine police procedures fail. But sometimes he failed too. Because remember, he couldn't depend on the gift. But I said that already, didn't I? Frank drove through the amber and green checkerboard of the Kansas landscape. The roads were straight, roughly paved, the oil drawn up from their asphalt surfaces by the blistering sun. All the way to the horizon, he could see farmhouses and dilapidated barns in the swell of shallow hills and the fields of wheat. Bales of it dotted the countryside. He found the words Miner's Cove scrawled on a wooden sign beside a dirt road that jutted off to his right. Somebody had stuck another sign on a fence post, County Road 120. A tangle of weeds formed a single line down the center of the road. He could feel it scrape the underside of the car. Most of the houses along that stretch, they looked friendly, he said, like something from an old home magazine. All of them had mailboxes out by the road with either a name or a number on them. But he wasn't finding anything even close to Denison or 448. Finally, he glimpsed a figure mowing a vast, sloping lawn, and he decided to make an inquiry. The air was sweet with the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the figure that he thought was a man in jeans and shirt, well, it turned out to be a woman. He guessed that she saw him in her peripheral vision as the car approached because she turned with a quizzical look on her face, and the beat-up straw hat, it shaded her features, but even from where he was, he could see that she was a tough customer. She cut the motor on the riding mower, and she waited for him to get out of the car.
Lost, are you?
Well, more misplaced, I think, Frank said. I'm looking for 448 Miners Cove.
What's the name?
Denison, Frank called. Janet.
Well, there's your problem. That house was torn down 3 years ago.
And Frank said, well, I'm not looking to buy the property. I'm wanting to find Mrs. Denison herself.
Well, that ain't so hard to do.
That's when she climbed down from the moor and she ambled over toward Frank, wiping her brow with a rag that Frank said she pulled out of her hip pocket. Oh, she was a big woman. You know, that kind of big that makes you think of words like grandma and bear hugs. You know the kind. Tough as nails and soft as butter.
You know, I ain't looking to help a bill collector if that's your game. Don't want to sick one of them on an old woman fighting cancer and every other kind of thing those so-called golden years heap on us.
Well, that's when he introduced himself, and he was about to say that he was an investigator working with the sheriff's office, but she was ahead of him.
The Audrey Hilliard killing? Don't know what Janet can do to help you there. Nobody round here seen Audrey in, I don't know exactly how many years before the other day.
Frank asked if she had known Audrey Hilliard.
Nope. She was a big Hollywood star by the time me and my husband settled here. His kinfolk's been in these parts for generations, and this is where he wanted to retire. Colorado cold was hard on him, and Kansas seemed fine to me.
And Frank asked if that's when she got to know Janet Denison.
Nice woman. Got cancer bad now, though.
Well, once again, the gift kicked in, but he couldn't make any sense of it. He said he had a strong impression of some terrible heartbreak. The feeling came when she mentioned her husband, and at the same time, Frank said he heard church bells, way off in the distance, you know. But he knew the woman in front of him. She couldn't hear them. So he decided to just stay quiet and let her do the talking.
Of course, everybody knew the stories. You a detective, you say?
Well, there it was, the same old question again. But he had to answer it, so he said, "Ever hear of a psychic investigator?"
You mean like those TV shows? Ghost Whisperer, The Medium, that kind of thing? Well, blow me away. They's for real? You must do good at fortune telling. That's a mighty fancy car. I never rode in nothing that spiffy. It's a good-looking contraption, yes, sir.
Frank just sort of shook his head and he said, yeah, it's an airport rental. They were out of midsize, just upgraded as a courtesy. You know how they do that. Look, about Miss Dennison.
Now that I think about it, I heard about you. I didn't know your name or that you'd be out this way looking for Janet, but Tony told me he let a guy in the Liberty building yesterday that was from out of town, here to help figure out who killed Audrey, he said. Well, you must be who he was talking about.
Well, Frank couldn't help but laugh about that, and he said, "Does everybody know everybody around here?"
Why, hey, Tony's been my buddy going on 30 years now. My husband worked at his dad's hardware store. We all went to the same church.
Frank said that a wave of goosebumps washed over him right then, and he knew something was happening, something, but he didn't know what.
Then the old bugger just up and left me, he did. Ran off with a gal from the choir.
So, there it was, the church bells, her feeling of immense hurt and pain. Yeah, the gift was throwing him a tidbit, all right. Just a tidbit.
Tony, him and his wife, they were my rock. Kind of like my own kids when that happened. And they stayed close. Tony still calls every morning to see if I made it through the night. You know, it was awful the way Audrey Hilliard treated him when he was nice enough to pick her up at the train station. That woman was mean as a scorpion.
What Frank said was, "Oh, and what happened?" But what he was thinking was that maybe this woman killed her philandering husband, and that was the old murder the gift was trying to tell him about. How would it tie into the death of Audrey Hilliard, though?
I'll tell you what happened. Tony's polite. He's always polite. So I know he wouldn't have been rude when he reminded her how they was dance partners at the ballroom all them years ago. And you know what she said to him? She said, real huffy-like, "I had so many dance partners I couldn't possibly remember them all." Dismissed him just like that. Cut Tony to the quick. Not just 'cause she didn't remember him, but the mean way she said it. She brushed him off like a cookie crumb. There's no need in that kind of ugliness. None at all.
Well, sounds like he got over it, though, Frank said. He let her into the ballroom just a few hours later. And Connie shot right back, "He did not." And Frank said, "Well, then how'd she get in?"
Well, bigger question to me is why did she get in? What was she doing there anyway? It wasn't like a killer was hanging around that old place, waiting to knock somebody off. There's a lot of questions that need answering if you ask me.
You've been listening to Murder at the Liberty Ballroom. Episode 2. Esther Luttrell adapted the audio script from Dennis Smirl's short story of the same name. Sheriff William Crane was played by Mark Schwartz, Nicole Oloney played Connie, And I'm Jack Diamond, inviting you to soar on the wings of imagination.
You know, one of the things I most enjoy doing in post-production is laying in the music for our programs. And we are so very grateful to David Fesliyan and his team at Fesliyan Studios. All of them, incredible composers and performers. David Rinda, Steve Oxen, David Robson. These guys contribute their talent and their time to helping producers like me turn out the very best productions possible. And if you're a podcaster, check out Fesliyan Studios and their fabulous music library. It's free and it's unbelievably professional. Sound effects in this production, they came from Free Sound, and we can't say enough good about them either. So thank you, David Fesliyan, and thank you, Free Sound. Just one more thank you, and we'll call it a day. Those church bells that you heard, you know, the ones that Frank heard when he was talking to Connie, those were provided by, it's called Universe Field, one word, and that's from Pixabay. So another big thank you for nice church bells. So how about next Sunday, the same time, same place, right here at this dinner table, when we'll have another cup of coffee, another piece of pie, and I'll tell you how Frank got into the most serious jam, he said, that he's ever been in his life. It's amazing he got out alive. I'll tell you something else you don't want to miss. You don't want to miss what Janet has to say.